Bacchus was the Greek god of wine, whereas Enos was the Roman god of wine. So it's Oenos, and so he's the Roman god of wine, and enology is the study and the art and the science behind winemaking.
Now Bacchus gets all the attention.
He does, because he's a lovely roly-poly little fellow, and he is always half inebriated.
And what about Enos? What happened to him?
Enos was probably a bit more austere and a bit more aloof, and probably a little bit more arrogant too.
Okay.
But he still liked to drop. But he used to put lots of interesting concoctions in there, not just the basic wine. He used to love to, in Roman times, and Greek a little bit before them, but the Romans used to love to change the flavours by adding all sorts of things, some of them quite narcotic in fact. So the wine was very, very strong in those times, partly preservative, partly just for flavour and structure and just different dabblings.
So how do you find out all of this stuff about Roman wines? That was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, but there's plenty of history, there's plenty of study being done in the past, mythology, fact, fiction, it's all melded together.
Have they ever dug up any old wine?
Oh, absolutely. The oldest winery they've pulled up is 6,000 years ago, and that was in the Baltic states. That was in Russian area, and that in fact is the home of the vineyards. And it's interesting that some of the techniques that they still use today are now becoming modern again after 6,000 years. They used to hide amphora under the ground. An amphora is just a large vase, I guess. But they used to bury them underground. Why did they do that? Because it keeps them cool, so the fermentation would go more slowly. So the first winery I ever worked in, which was Roseworthy College Winery, they actually buried concrete pipes in the ground. It was a cheap way to build it, but it also kept the wine cool during fermentation, down to about 15 degrees. So it's very clever. So those techniques are actually being resurrected to this day, 6,000 years later.
Now, you're a bit of a world traveller. You've lived and worked all over the place, from the homeland of red wine in Bordeaux to California's Napa Valley, and even the unlikely vineyards of Indonesia, where I think this keeping the wine cool would be quite a challenge.
No? With modern equipment, it's quite interesting. I mean, the grapevine is very adaptable, and it grows in many areas. Even though it came from the Baltic states, and it was grown in very, very cool conditions, supposedly where Noah landed his ark and then came out and built a vineyard.
He did, and got drunk.
Yeah, and he did too, quite drunk.
Yes.
But the vine has transposed itself very, very readily to many climates. So you've got old world wine, which is France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all those areas, the Baltic states and so on. But then there became the new world winemaking, which is Australia, it became California, expanded into South Africa and so on. And many of those new world wineries have the same sort of climates, particularly like Tasmania and Victoria and South Australia, Western Australia. Magnificent wines can grow because the vine adapts very well. But about 20 years ago, they started to say, well, we want some too in the what we'd call the tropical world wineries. And tropical world wineries have developed in that tropical band through Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, up in the mountains of India, Bali, Indonesia, the Pacific islands, and there is quite readily growing vines there, and they make different wine. I'm not saying it's great, I'm just saying it's different. But just like old world, new world is very different. So tropical world wines can be very pleasurable, very enjoyable, particularly with the hot, spicy foods, lower alcohols, served lovely and chilled on the beach in Sanoa. They're not bad.
I went to a local vineyard here years ago, and the grapevines grow amongst the banana trees. It's quite an odd sight, actually. But they did say they had to actually buy in grapes from more southern parts to make them mix right. Is that something that happens in Indonesia as well?
Not specifically in Indonesia. It does happen around the world. I mean, many people now are finding that if you blend apples to make apple cider with strawberries, it makes a really interesting, fascinating drink. So we're learning new ways of making all sorts of beverages. These days with beer, we add citrus. Why would we do that? I mean, I love the Mexican beers. You go down the port, and all the people love a Mexican beer with a slice of lemon. Well, now they're actually fermenting beer with lemon. They're fermenting beer with ginger. They're fermenting beer with different things, just like with wine. I mean, you can make, in a home situation, you can make a lovely wine if you just use grape juice, but then spiced with an excess of, let's say, mangoes, when there's a glut of that fruit, and you can make a beautiful, luscious style that looks very like a Chardonnay.
A mango wine.
Yeah. But using the base of grapes, because the grapes is probably the most complete fruit. God had a real sense of humour when he made grapes, because it had the balance of acids and the balance of sugars, and it had the right sugar levels to create a product that was stable, both from a bug point of view, but also from a longevity and a keeping point of view. So it had a real sense of humour.
You're listening to ABC Sunshine Coast. It's 13 past 4. Mary Lou Stevens with you. And in the studio, I'm joined by winemaker Don Buchanan, who now these days calls the Sunshine Coast home after all his world travels. Now, wine of reasonable quality is quite cheap to buy these days. So why make your own at home?
As a hobby, it's very pleasurable. Many people have enjoyed making beer over the years. I mean, I guess the whole principle of making your own started after the Second World War. There was very little product available. France was decimated, Germany was decimated, south of France and so on, right round to Spain and so on. Italy was decimated. The top of Africa was decimated, so the vineyards were really a mess. But people still liked a glass of wine. They still liked it with food, because to me a glass of wine with food is just part of life. I mean, it's like a day without sunshine. It's pretty boring. So a day without a glass of wine is pretty boring. So they started brewing wines in the home, and they didn't have a lot of grapevines, but they did have other things that they could flavour the basic product with. So they started home brewing beer, they started home brewing wine, particularly because there wasn't even that much malt, there wasn't even that much barley to make beer out of after the war. And so it's just gone on, but now it's a pleasurable hobby. It's a real enjoyable thing to do, and it's not that difficult. Beer is relatively simple, wine is a little more complicated, but with modern technology it's actually become more and more easy and more readily available and accessible to people. And not because you don't have to use whole fruit. There's ways of bypassing the system. So you don't have to go to Brisbane and buy grapes that have been in a plastic box and been shipped up here from Tasmania or South Australia or from Victorian markets. You can actually do that, or you can use other products that will fulfill the same base. Either grape juice products, and you can get some simple products of juice in supermarkets, and use that as a basis and then add to it.
So say I went to the supermarket and just got grapes from the supermarket, would they make a decent wine?
You can make it quite an acceptable wine. It's not going to be great wine. You're not going to make a chateau quality Bordeaux wine, but nobody wants to pay $600-800 a bottle every day for a chateau quality bottle. You've got to wait 25 to 30 years before it's developed and soft enough that it's actually approachable.
Okay.
I mean, most people want to drink that they can make this week and in 6, 8, 10 weeks enjoy it.
Are there any dangers when it comes to making your own wine?
Yes, tasting it too often. Yeah, the explosion thing is potential, but if you use common sense, which is not always that common, but common sense does dictate it follows parameters, it follows rules. If you use too much priming sugar when you close the bottle, or it hasn't finished fermentation, yes, you can have a problem. But you can still make champagne at home, and it's not difficult these days with modern closures and modern bottles that you can collect, second hand. It's very easy to make good quality champagne, but you still got to follow the rules. If you break the rules on the road, you can run into disaster. If you break the rules in the kitchen, you can have a disaster. If you break the rules in the garden, you can still have a disaster.
Now, one of the things that's come up is cleanliness, making sure everything's
next to godliness.
Oh, okay.
Winemaking, cleanliness is next to godliness.
All right. But perhaps you have tried brewing beer or spirits. Have you ever had a go at spirits, Don?
My first job in the wine industry in 1969 was training as a distiller.
Okay.
So yeah, again, simple rules, quite simple rules, and it is easy to make. I mean, most Europeans make spirits in their own home. They make their own brandy, they make their own aquavit, they make their own flavoured spirits. It's very, very common, very common, and it's quite simple. Of course, we know about the Russians; they tend to make a fair bit of it, but in bigger volumes too. But yeah, many Europeans can make with simple equipment that is readily available, easy to buy, and you can buy it here. There are people that sell quite simple distilling apparatus, and if you just follow the simple rules, yeah, it's not a difficulty at all.
What's grappa? Because I remember having that once and it almost killed me.
Grappa essentially is after the fermentation of red grapes, there's obviously some sugar, some alcohol left in the skins after you press the skins. If you rinse those skins and wash them, then you'll recover the alcohol, or if it's incomplete fermentation, you'll recover the sugar, and then you can ferment the last of it into alcohol. Because alcohol is just yeast eating sugar and pooing alcohol. That's all that happens. So you can save that liquor, that liquid, and you distill it, which means separating the water, throwing the water away, and ending up with the grappa. Grappa is quite a raw, simple product, but once it's matured, it becomes just like a brandy. It comes from the grapes, and so it, matured and softened and aged. It's beautiful.
Well, the stuff I had was more like methylated spirits, I got to say.
Yeah, if it's 5 minutes old and it's made by Uncle Freddie, well, it could well be.
What are the errors that rookie brewers make, or rookie winemakers make? They're at home and they're having all kinds of trouble. What are some of the simple things that go wrong?
The simple things is not getting a correct yeast culture. I mean, bread making yeast is not suitable for making wine. Beer making yeast, which is Saccharomyces caelum-bergensis, is not suitable for making wine. It adds the wrong flavours, structures, integrity to the product. So you've got to use Saccharomyces cerevisiae or Saccharomyces bayanus, and it's very simple these days. I mean, 10 years ago it wasn't that easy, but now you can go to a home brew shop and they've got very, very good quality yeast, and you can buy a packet for just a few dollars. You can grow it properly before you begin your winemaking process, so it's strong and vigorous, just like you would for your ginger beer, just like you would for your beer, or for that matter, for making your bread. Just allowing it to grow and be healthy, and then cleanliness.
Next to godliness, as you said. So this has been your career, Don, and now you're retired, but it's something that you're still doing. So you're actually doing winemaking classes.
Yes, well, I just felt that there might be a need, there might be an interest, and so we're doing a 2-hour program explaining in simple terms how approachable and easy it can be if you want to take on a hobby of making wine. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to drive 1,000 miles to buy fruit from South Australia and so on. I mean, there are vineyards here, and there are even vineyards that weren't picked last season because they couldn't sell the fruit. So people are approachable. You can talk to people. You can buy fruit out of the markets, and it's quite adequate, and you can blend those fruits with other fruits. I mean, there's nothing wrong with like they do in Bali. There's traditional winemakers in Bali that have been making wine there for 40 years, but they use snake fruit. They use all sorts of strange and weird and wonderful, and some of the product is really, really interesting. Really interesting. Not bad at all.
What's been the best wine you've ever made, Don?
The best wine depends on the day. I mean, it depends on what you're having it with.
Okay.
I mean, if I'm having a beautiful roast lamb, well, obviously I'll have a Pinot Noir that's been decanted and allowed to open, and I mean, I'd probably pick a Tasmanian, or I'd pick a southern New Zealand wine, and there's some magnificent Pinot Noirs. They're soft and approachable, and they've got cherry-like characters, and it complements the product. But if I was having fish and chips down at the port and feeding the seagulls, well, obviously I'd be trying a different product, because you couldn't appreciate the quality of the wine. And when I was sitting in Bordeaux in France and visiting a chap I'd met and became very friends with him, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were drinking one of his own special wines. I mean, it was a rather unique experience, and nibbling on sausage at, let's say 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, it had to be his wine, it had to be France, and it was just wonderful.
But what about yourself, the wines that you've made perhaps at home? Have you got any ones tucked away for a special occasion?
Well, I've never made wines at home for myself because I've always been working in commercial wineries. I mean, my smallest batch of wine might have been 100,000 litres. So, you know, and I've had winemakers making wine for me when I was the managing director and controlling. So, yeah, but I guess the wines I'm most proud of are wines I had in my own winery in Tasmania, Buchanan Wines, when I was working for Arrowfield Winery in the Hunter Valley, the triple trophy and gold medals and world trips, and I mean they're magnificent Chardonnays and just beautiful wines. But you know, the longevity, the aged wines that last and live, probably an 88 Tasmanian Pinot, which is still a magnificent wine, still holding together, made in 1988.
Sounds good. I'd like to smell it.
It's absolutely mother's milk. It's just got the most beautiful characters.